Hi, Tom here. In this week's Circle Line Art School video, I'll show you one way to draw Diagon from Harry Potter. For this drawing, I will use some A4 paper, a 4B pencil, a soft dark pencil, and a few black pens. The first step is to draw a horizon line as a soft guideline. Next, draw a vanishing point in the center of your horizon line as a guide for all the receding lines which will go towards this one single vanishing point, as this is a drawing in 1-point perspective. Next, draw a small, long, thin rectangle around this vanishing point, and this is for the furthest away building from us, the viewer. Now draw 2 vertical lines either side for the corners of 2 more buildings. And then you could draw 4 diagonal lines from the corners of the long, thin rectangle to these new lines. Next, extend your 2 buildings by drawing 2 rectangles, one on each side. Now draw 2 longer vertical lines for the sides of the main diagonally. Next, use your vanishing point and draw 4 diagonal lines from the top and the base of the long vertical lines away from the vanishing point and towards the viewer of the image, us. So it's best to remember that this is diagonally, not diagonally. But we have to talk about diagonals and drawing lines diagonally. So there we go. Next, draw 2 more receding lines towards the vanishing point for the height of the first story of the buildings, left and right. Now, from the base of our original long, thin rectangle, draw some steps in the far distance. Just a series of horizontal lines that get wider as they come towards us. Next, you could start to add some of the details to the distant buildings. Many of the lines will be at odd angles, diagonals. Now you have the basic shapes for this drawing. The lines at this stage are just guidelines for these basic shapes. Now draw the dome on top of Gringotts Wizarding Bank, and then a few lines for the Gringotts Dragon, just to indicate its basic shape. Next, we can start to draw the columns of Gringotts Bank, with crooked angles at the top, windows between the columns, and the main door at the base. All of these are very small shapes because it's at the distance. And remember, these are guidelines, and you might want to go over the guidelines and make them more accurate later on, or maybe go over them with some black pens. Next, you could draw some of the details for the other distant buildings, including rooftops and windows as you draw. At this stage, we're building on the basic shapes. It is best, I think, just to sketch out the details in a loose way, adding whatever you think will work well for your drawing. You could work back into the drawing later and define the lines with some pen work. So at this stage, we're dividing up the various shapes. So the details in the foreground, the area nearest us, we can use a firmer line with the pencil to make a darker mark. and therefore the lines will look like they're nearer us, the viewer, in contrast to the lines in the background of the distant buildings, which are softer lines. When you are ready, start to draw the left-hand side, starting with the arched doorway. At this stage, we can break up the shapes into smaller shapes on the left and on the right, so that they can become the various shops along the alley. On the right, we can draw some semicircles and ellipses for the bowed window fronts. All of the ellipses, the curves seen from an angle, if they're above the horizon line, we're looking up at them, and if they're below the horizon line, we're looking down at them. So the windows above are receding towards the vanishing point. So the receding lines, the receding diagonal lines, will go towards the single vanishing point. But the vertical lines stay roughly vertical. But it's, because this is diagonally, we want the lines not to be perfectly vertical, because there are many odd-shaped diagonal lines within Diagon Alley. On the left-hand side, we can draw some shapes to indicate if the facade, the front of the buildings, are flat, or if they sort of recede in areas, so they go back a little bit. Whenever an area goes backwards, away from the front surface, the lines going back will be horizontal lines, but the diagonal lines going away will be diagonal lines going to the vanishing point at the end of Diagon Alley. So it's starting to take shape. At this stage, I find it's generally best to add more lines than perhaps you need, because it's easy enough to edit them out later on. And then we can draw some of the hanging lights, or the signs which are hanging from wrought iron, extending arms from the facades, from the fronts of the buildings. Now obviously the areas at the left and right of the image are closest to us, so the shapes in these areas will be larger, and the shapes as they go towards the vanishing point will get smaller. Even if you want to draw an image like this using a pen, it's a good idea to work it out in pencil first, because then you can work out how the shapes relate to each other and how they overlap, because it's quite difficult to draw an image like this in pen straight away, because you'd have to work out which lines go in front of other lines, and then you need to not really make a mistake about the order in which the lines you draw are placed, as well as the position of them. But when you're drawing in pencil, you can just draw all of the lines that you need, and it doesn't matter if they overlap, because we can erase the areas that overlap if they get in the way of the drawing. On the far right, we can draw the top and sides of a doorway that's very close to us, so it's one of the larger shapes within the drawing. But it's not a critical shape in a way, because it's at the edge, but it's still important. So now we have the basic pencil sketch of Diagon Alley. using a lot of diagons. Using lines drawn diagonally. And now speeding up the drawing, just adding some pen work, starting with the Gringotts dragon, which protects the bank, which is sort of wrapped over the top of the dome at the top of the corner of the bank. For the pen work, I'm using thinner pens for the more distant shapes, so the actual thickness of the pen lines are really thin. But I'll use a different pen for the shapes which are nearer us, because not only are the shapes larger because they're nearer, but the lines of the shapes can also be thicker because they're nearer. So this little difference between different pens for different areas would be useful in a drawing like this. So if you do have a thin pen, use it for the detail of the shapes in the background, in the distance. And then if you have a thicker pen, use it for the shapes which are near to us. If you've only got one pen, what I tend to do is just to double up the lines, which will double up the thickness. So you draw a line, then draw another line right next to it, and then that will make the thin line thicker, because there are basically two lines, but you can only really see the one line, but you've drawn two lines. So most of the distance is outlines and edge lines, but in the foreground, the buildings on the left and the right of the main image, some of these areas we can block in with bigger chunks of darkness or of blackness later on. So here is a slightly thicker pen for the lines which are near us on the curved arch of the doorway on the left hand side. And the pencil lines really are just a guideline. The pen lines are really the finished decisions in the drawing of the pen lines, and the positioning lines are the pencil lines. So it's quite useful, I think, to think of it in that way, that the only lines which are permanent and precise and definite are the pen lines. And however much it was an effort to draw the pencil lines, they're still just a guide, and it really only matters what the pen lines, it really only matters how the pen lines work. With a drawing like this as well, sometimes it's useful to think of some areas where you'd want lots of detail, but when you work with a pen, if you put lots of detail together, that area becomes darker because you have lots of lines together that make it look dark. So it's quite a good idea to remember that the sky can be just left as a blank paper, and other areas might be left undrawn so that the image doesn't get too dense. Although saying that, I think it would be quite fun to draw all of the bricks on all of the buildings. But to draw the bricks on the buildings, I'll probably use a thin pen for the distant ones and a thicker pen for the near ones. So here we can add some shapes, add some signs, because it needs to look a bit more cluttered than what I've already drawn. So not just drawing the details, but adding more details as you go along and repeating shapes, but changing their position or changing the style of them a little bit as well. Now some of the lines in distance could be slightly darker, just particularly if they're the edge of shapes. It always helps to put the tiles individually on a roof, on a tiled roof. It just takes time, there's no quick way to do it. But think about the angles of the lines. And then the panes of the windows, small little panes, because in the past it was difficult to make large panes of glass, so they could only really make small ones, and that's why older windows often have lots of little panes of glass rather than modern buildings which have just enormous sheets of glass. And I think I want to block in some darker areas just with a pen and taking some time. So the insides of the windows, some of the lines or the edges of some of the buildings, you might want to make them darker. So I hope you found this drawing useful for your own drawings. If you'd like to know more about drawing, please visit my website, circlearnartschool.com, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Circle Line Art School, to keep up to date with all the content that I make. Thanks for watching and see you next time.